email. I'm really excited tonight to have with us several panelists who are awesome educators who've worked with our program and do great work at getting kids outside and exploring. And I'm excited that they're going to be able to share their experiences with you, as well as some of their insights into what it's like to incorporate inquiry into the classroom. So I want to start off just by introducing people to Zoom. In case you're not extra familiar with it this year, just want to make sure that you know where everything is. So to begin, when I shared my screen, it probably went full screen for you. So I'm going to advise that you actually exit full screen, and you can do that from either hitting escape or going to the top of your menu here and hitting exit full screen. The next thing that you should do is go ahead and find that chat icon and click on that. That'll dock the chat window to the side of your screen for you so you can see any conversation that's happening there. And then step 3 would be to find your to section right above where you would type, and make sure that that is set to send to all panelists and attendees, or it might also say to everyone. And then again, that'll just make sure that everybody in the chat window and in the chat room can share in the conversation. All right, so let's go ahead, test out that chat window. Why don't you go ahead and tell us where you're from and what your role as an educator is? High school teacher from Portland, Oregon. Awesome. Davis, California. Field trips for school groups. That's awesome. Urban nature guide in Seattle. Homeschool family. Awesome. High school in Minnesota. I'm seeing a really wonderful mix of formal and informal educators, a lot of different grade bands from all over the country. Awesome. It's so great to have you all here with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kelly Schaefer, and I'll be the host of our panel webinar tonight. And I am from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where our mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds. I specifically work with the K-12 education team, where our mission is to create innovative resources and trainings that build science skills while inspiring young people to connect to local habitats, explore biodiversity, and engage in citizen science projects. I'm joined today by Susan Licker, our education specialist, who will be in the chat window sharing links and answering your questions. So please feel free to share your thoughts and ask questions there as well. And then, of course, today I am joined by our awesome panelists, Jeff, Kathy, Phil, and Terry, who will be introducing us to some of their work. So on the K-12 education team, we achieve our mission in 2 main ways: through curricular resources and educator training. So our curricular resources can be anything from a full science kit, science unit, to free resources that are one-offs that you can download just to get kids outside having fun. We also try to support some of the deeper learning that we promote through educator training, which can both be online or in person. We want to make sure that we're supporting educators as they're taking on some of these awesome opportunities to get kids outside. All of our resources really fall in these 3 fundamental pillars of nature connection, citizen science, and inquiry. So we want to get kids outside, we want to get them with hands-on experience, exploring, and then moving them along a pathway to experiencing science in deep, authentic, and meaningful ways. And part of that end goal is getting kids to participate in inquiry projects. which is the subject of our webinar tonight. And part of this reason that we want to focus on these three pillars is that we want to sort of change the conception of what a scientist is for our students. A lot of times, if you were to ask a kid to draw a scientist, you're going to get something like this great drawing here, or we have a guy in a white lab coat. He's got beakers and equations, and often there's like fun Einstein hair. This guy has a really awesome mustache. And this is science, right? But this is a fairly narrow conception of what science is. So we want to broaden that idea for our kids. We want them to start viewing folks like bees as scientists, people who are outside observing our natural world and helping us understand it better. All the way down to this, where kids are outside doing science and then seeing themselves as scientists. So we want to help kids see that they can be scientists, that they already have so many traits that scientists have, that curiosity and the ability to ask really great questions. Kids can be scientists, and we want everyone to be able to view themselves as thinking like a scientist. And a great way to achieve that is by incorporating inquiry practices into your classroom. So I just want to take a second here and make sure we're all visioning sort of the same things when we are thinking about inquiry. So inquiry could really simply be said to be asking and answering your own questions in science. It's this opportunity to provide kids with a really authentic science experience. As educators, it can be a little intimidating, right? Because you gotta let go of the reins a little bit. You gotta follow your kids, let them lead. And it can be a little intimidating to tackle this at first, but also very rewarding. It includes ideas of things like project-based learning, where kids are focusing in on one subject very deeply and learning a lot of skills that are transferable, things like researching, writing reports, critical thinking. And you'll notice that when we participate in the inquiry process and start doing investigations, that we're meeting a lot of the next generation science standards just pretty inherently. So asking questions, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, all of these things are part of the inquiry process. There are a lot of different types of inquiry. There are four main types, and they're kind of on this continuum from more closed forms of inquiry to more open forms of inquiry. We're starting out with things like confirmation inquiry, which is what I remember doing in like high school chemistry, when you would mix two chemicals together in particular quantities, knowing that you would get a particular precipitate to result. So students are following a prescribed procedure with a known result. Then there are things like structured inquiry, where the students are still investigating a teacher presented question with a prescribed procedure, but the result might not be known. And then we move into the more sort of open-ended inquiry opportunities with guided inquiry, things where students are investigating a teacher presented question, but have the opportunity to design or develop their methods for how they're going to investigate that question. Then all the way to open inquiry, where students are investigating their own questions, formulating their own methods, and developing their own procedures for investigating those questions. Now, you can provide a really great science opportunity and experience anywhere along this continuum of inquiry, but we provide students with a really in-depth and authentic experience of science when we venture more towards that open-ended inquiry with guided inquiry and open inquiry. And this can take the form of both observational and experimental studies. So you could have kids observing just things that are happening outside of your window, or you could actually be changing a variable and doing an experimental study. We do have resources to help you embrace these opportunities, because it can be a little bit of a messy process when we think about doing an inquiry investigation. I like thinking of them as investigations. There are these hands-on opportunities with the science process where you can really get kids outside and doing these first two steps, making observations, and those questions will naturally sort of come out of it, and embracing those questions and turning them into research opportunities. This poster pictured here is actually featured in our investigating evidence curriculum, which is a really great resource for you if you are interested in embracing these and want a little bit of scaffolding. So this will help you think about the scientific process, how to get kids involved in investigations. It'll lay out some potential timelines for you. So this is available as a free resource that you can download from our website, and Susan will share a link to that in the chat window in a moment. With that in mind, now that we have kind of a shared idea of what's inquiry and some of the things that go into it, I want to turn it over to our lovely panelists who are going to tell us a little bit about what inquiry looks like in their classrooms and how they encourage observations and questions. Oh, wait, I forgot. I got so excited about our panelists. I forgot about the SciGirls Strategies. I did want to bring this to your attention because we're probably all aware that there is a STEM gap between the genders. So somewhere in early elementary, girls stop identifying themselves as enjoying STEM, as being capable of doing STEM, but there isn't a corresponding achievement gap. So girls are still performing as well in math and science. So somewhere along the way, this interest or this idea that girls can be scientists and other genders can be scientists falls away. So these SciGirls is a program from the Minnesota Public Television, and they do some awesome programs there. And incorporated with their show, they did this research that compiled strategies that can kind of decrease this gender gap. And what's great about these strategies is that don't just work for girls, they work for all genders, and they work across different cultural contexts as well. So you're not leaving anybody else by embracing some of these strategies. Things like connecting girls' STEM's experiences to their lives, supporting them as they investigate questions and solve problems, and helping girls embrace the struggle to overcome challenges, which can increase their self-confidence. All of these things you'll notice are going to be part of that inquiry investigation process of learning to ask questions, of trying to figure out how to do your design, your experiment, or your observational study. So inquiry provides us with an opportunity to incorporate some of these strategies, which makes everyone feel welcome in science. All right, and with that thought in mind, I want to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to tell us a little bit about his experiences. Jeff, take it away. Oh, you're muted. Sorry, we muted everyone.
There, okay.
Go.
I thought you had to do it, so all right. Hi, I'm Jeff Manker. I used to teach high school in Gilroy, California. This was my high school ornithology class, and it was a year-long class, and we did a balance of academic in-classroom, learning about birds, and then we also once a week we were outside bird watching for about an hour and a half every Tuesday. And I think the combination of the two was really nice for the kids because they loved being out of the classroom, but they got to learn things inside that they could apply outside. And of course, one of the things that I did was I used the investigating evidence module from Cornell, and it worked really well with the students. So next slide, please. Often in science classes, high school students may feel like the chickens in these cages, that they're held in place and they can't experiment and do things the way they want to. There's a recipe or a cookbook kind of activity that they do, and everyone knows what the outcome's going to be. You know, the liquid's going to turn blue or it's going to turn red or whatever, and they don't get to experiment much. And having taught biology and AP biology and a bunch of other classes, I knew that kids needed something different. So that's why I started the ornithology class. And next slide. I wanted my students to feel like this. I wanted them to feel free to wander and to learn things on their own and discover things, just like these chickens are finding their own food in these clumps of grass. My students were finding things out about birds by investigating them themselves. And part of doing that is you have to let them be free. Next slide. You have to let them find things on their own. Like the picture on the left there are two baby Anna's hummingbirds that had fallen out of the tree and were on the ground. And my students came to me and said, "Oh my gosh, we have to do something." And I said, "Are you sure? Like, let's step back and see what happens." And they were so worried that something was going to happen. And I said, "Let's just wait, you know, pull back." So we stepped back about 50 feet. Of course, they all had binoculars so we could watch. And the mother came and fed the babies right there. We did decide to put them up in the tree because we had a lot of cats on campus. So we found a space up high and we put them on there. And we think they were okay. The second picture was a bird that crashed into a window and killed itself on accident. We broke its neck. And they brought it to me and wanted to know what it was. And so we went through looking at it and figuring out using a field guide what it was. And I took a picture of the legs in particular because this is a sharp-shinned hawk. And I wanted them to see that its shins really are very narrow, and it's actually its foot, but I didn't tell them that, but the shins are higher up. So we got a chance to investigate this bird up close, which is something that most of them had never been able to do. And it gave them a good opportunity to learn something on their own. Next slide, please. So it's really important to let them explore on their own. And this is an example of where they were outside doing that. Each kid had their own field guide in the bag. They had binoculars. And here, without me telling them what to do or where to look, they were finding birds on their own, calling other friends over, "Hey, you got to see this," and then trying to figure out what it is on their own. And I think that's a really great thing. Birding really allows them to do stuff like that, where this is sort of a small scale, you know, just figuring out what species you're looking at or what it's doing, but it's something they don't get to do too much in regular school, except maybe looking something up in a book. And I think this really helps them expand their mind. Next slide. The other thing is I like to allow them to be silly too, because high school kids sometimes, a lot of the fun is wrung out of learning. And so here I had them making paper airplanes with different shaped wings to see how they fly differently, just like birds have different shaped wings. And then after we did this activity, which they had to measure how they flew, where they went, etc., then we could compare them to bird wings, you know, like an accipiter, like the sharp-shinned hawk, has short, broad wings, whereas an albatross has long, skinny wings, and they fly very differently. So I wanted them to try it out, and of course they were having fun, although the girl in the red sweatshirt looks really bored, but okay, next one. I like to challenge them. This was an activity when we were learning about reproduction. I taught them all about different nest types. And then I said, now you're going to build your own nest. And they had to bring in materials, and they had to use all natural materials and build it with their own two hands in about a half an hour, which is a lot shorter than most birds spend on their nests, but they have hands, so it's a lot easier. They didn't have to use their mouth. So here's a couple slides so you can go through them, where they're getting closer and closer. And then this is the finished product. And I would then put a raw chicken egg in it and shake it. And they had to, you know, of course, I told them ahead of time I was going to do this. So they had to make it strong enough that it wouldn't fall through the bottom or fall off the side. It had to be big enough to hold the egg, and it had to have a certain je ne sais quoi, as I said, which means a certain something that makes it have some flair. So kids added flowers and all kinds of stuff, and they really had they really struggled at first, how to start and where to get it going, and to cooperate with each other. And I told them it's all part of the process, just like a bird. They have to work with their mate and figure out how to do it. And they eventually worked it out. They have fun doing it, and they learned something. They learned that, birds work really hard to do this sort of thing. So, okay, next slide. So back to investigating evidence. I thought this was really good for high school students because they've gone through school, and some of them have had a lot of science, some have had very little, but most of them have done too much cookbook science that they don't remember how to ask their own question. They're almost afraid to. And this really doesn't tell them what question to ask, but shows them how to ask it and how to go about answering that question. And I really like that, because a lot of kids just, at this age, they're in high school, they're often afraid to make a fool of themselves in front of their friends. And so this helps them set up sort of guidelines of how to do it. And then they check in with each other and myself and make sure that they are on track to, try and solve the problem. Even if they don't solve it, they can still come up with an answer that is acceptable. It doesn't have to be, solving the problem, but they figure out that they can't solve it this way or whatever, but that's part of science. So I really love this module, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to let their kids have a free range experience like those chickens. So, okay. Next slide is an example of some students that I worked with last year, just before COVID hit us. And these are some high school students. This is after I retired. I was a science advisor for these kids who were studying a lagoon in Santa Cruz about what birds use which habitat. And they put up camera traps and did observations and had to come up with a hypothesis. And honestly, I went straight back to investigating evidence to help these kids, and they really appreciated it and helped them set up how to do a graph and how to present their materials. They were supposed to present their final thing to the staff at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, but COVID got in the way and we had to do it all virtually. But they did a great job, and Cornell's materials really work. I would highly recommend them. So anyway, that's me.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Sure.
I really appreciate hearing your experience, encouraging your kids to kind of get out of that box of, oh gosh, I can't look like I don't know what I'm doing, and just embrace that experimenting.
Right.
Awesome. Well, now I'd like to invite Kathy to share her experiences.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Kathy Rigling, and I'm a retired middle school science teacher. Well, semi-retired. I'm actually teaching an 8th grade class this year virtually. And I still currently am a nature coordinator for an environmental camp locally. So I have the experience with the Cornell materials, both as a public school teacher and as an informal educator. And I've used them in both places. So you can go to the next slide, please. So a few years back at one of the schools I was at, I had many moves, like some of you have that are public school teachers. And one move was into a portable. And I thought, oh boy, portable. Well, it turned out to be a really great thing because it had these windows and there was trees. And I love birds anyway, so I put feeders out. Then I found out about Project Feeder Watch, which is a good baby step way you can get into citizen science with your classes. I recommend it. And so we would watch the feeders from November to April and keep data on that. And that was great for a few years. And then I got moved again. And this time, this is the picture outside. This is what outside my window looked like. It was just grasses and weeds. I'm in Florida, so weeds love to grow here. and probably a lot of non-native stuff in there. And so I was like, oh, I'm just bummed out. So I asked my principal, I said, can we do like a native plant garden in there? And can I put up some bird feeders and a bird bath? And they were like, yeah, sure. So you can go to the next slide. So we had some work days. The school actually had a yearly, actually twice a year beautification day. And so I have a nature club. It's another cool thing you can do to incorporate some of these kinds of things that, I know in public school right now, in most places, your curriculum is very, very, very tight and structured. So I would use my nature club to do some of the other things that we couldn't do in class and engage the kids and try to encourage kids to come out. So my nature club was tasked with, well, let's, design a garden. Let's see where we can, get some plants from. And so, and I did a lot of that outreach because middle schoolers, and it's kind of hard to get them to do those kinds of things. But I was able to get some donations, even had someone, a friend of mine that was a science teacher, also worked at Walmart in the photo lab. And there's a lady that always brought in beautiful pictures of butterflies. And she had a great butterfly garden. So she gave me these wonderful cuttings, and they were native plants. So it was a work in progress. We got a lot done that first work day. And then on the right, you could see it was really over, in Florida, we're lucky. We have a good climate. And I had these beautiful trees, which is a big plus. And they were native oak trees, which, as you know, are great places for birds to go because there's a lot of caterpillars. So things move pretty quick. So you can go to the next slide. So I thought, well, anyways, sidetrack here. The investigating evidence. I found that I had been aware of Cornell's educational resources for a few years, kind of through the back door of Feeder Watch. And then I found out about being an ambassador. Then I go to webinars. So I found this curriculum, and it was great. And, you heard Jeff talk about high school. Well, it's excellent for middle school. And you can tailor this to wherever you need it. And what's really neat, it's not something you have to do middle, beginning, middle, end. You can kind of tailor what will fit with you. So this was a really cool activity. Like Kelly mentioned about, kids think that scientists work in labs and they have lab coat and they just do experiments in the lab. Well, they have this great little part of investigating evidence that has different scientists' short one-page biographies, perfect for middle school, perfect for incorporating content reading. And so each group, they got a scientist, and they had to look at, what was their research, what data do they collect, how do they do it, and what challenges did they have. And it was great because they really delved into it, and then they presented, and the kids got to hear about all these cool scientists. And guess what? They weren't working inside in a lab. I mean, occasionally they did, and it opened their eyes to see that science is not doing that scientific method. Oh boy, investigating evidence will get them out of that. Say, no, there's many different ways to do science. Okay, so that was really cool. So next slide. So we're getting back to my garden. So one thing I always have my kids do was keep a nature journal, because even though, and I know with all of you, if you're in public school, sometimes your curriculum changes. So I was originally teaching life science, which the nature journal fit in perfectly. Well, then we went to comp science, where we did a little this, a little that, a little that. I'm like, but you can still do the nature journal because they're learning to observe. And to me, that's a super important skill in middle school, because that's what scientists do. They observe and ask questions. So this is where you can build inquiry, getting them to ask questions. Because like Jeff said, sometimes they get it beat out of them, and they forget. They're like, oh, this is boring. But once you get them outside, so that's my classroom. It was really kind of cool because I could have a few kids out there at a time, and I could watch them from the window, and they could be out there writing in their nature journal. They can go out there, and in the beginning, I would give them prompts because they needed some structure, and I would do the prompt related to whatever we were studying. So if we were studying, food webs, I might have them, okay, go outside and find, a producer, a primary, secondary consumer. you know, and then draw a picture and describe what the relationship is, something like that. And other times they go out and they find something like, oh, we found this caterpillar. And it wasn't always birds, though we did have feeders. So that worked out really great. So go to the next slide. And I also had a little desk by the window. And see, I was lucky. I did have nice windows. So I was very fortunate there. And they could keep data. So we did do Project Feeder Watch, though this location was not as good as my other because the other one had a lot more trees. We were visited by more birds. This was a little busier. So when we got birds, it was really exciting, but it was okay because we could look back at old data and say, well, why did we see more mourning doves at the other location? And it taught them stuff. And then I branched out with eBird, and that's a great way to do citizen science, one of many ways, but it's a long established platform. And the kids could share, you know, maybe I was teaching a lesson and a hawk landed in the tree. Well, we're going to stop and talk about that hawk for a couple minutes because that's really amazing. And we could do an eBird checklist. And what was really fun is Great Backyard Bird Count, which just passed. We would do, I also had we had the early bird club too. So twice a month I would take any kids that wanted to out birding around the school. And there was some trees and stuff. And on that day, we could do the live map when you submit your data and they would see on the United States, there we are. It's exciting. They get excited about science. Okay, next slide. And of course, all these observations led them to make questions. So actually this year I was teaching 6th grade. And so what I had them do, I always had them do a project where they plan an investigation. Like if they were going to do it and they would, you know, figure out the variables and how they would collect data and stuff. So this is kind of what that. And so one of my students was inspired of, you know, oh, I want to know what type of feeder would attract birds. And so it gave them a lot of inspiration, and that could lead further down the road when they're in higher grades to investigations. And next slide. And so to segue, in the summer, I work at summer camp. And what's really cool, and I encourage you, if some of you teach younger grades, there's another great curriculum called Feathered Friends. And it's really good. It's every month, there's a different bird featured. There's activities, there's book connection, there's home things, and it works good for summer camp. So I would pull from that because in my summer camp, we do like a 4-year curriculum, and yay, this year's birds. Actually, last year was birds, but we did that virtual, and I'll get to that. And I found great activities because my summer camp is grades 3 to 6. So Feathered Friends, perfect. Inquiry, I'm a science teacher. So at camp, we would have a whiteboard. They could write, I wonder why questions up there. I had a corkboard. They could put little sticky notes of observations of things they saw. And of course, they kept a nature journal. It wasn't like the school nature journal. There'd be more drawings and, very free form, but they would write stuff down. Okay, and last but not least, next slide. I think this is my last one.
Just in time for your 1-minute warning.
Okay. So another thing, there's habitat connections. This is also great. And I'm sure you could use it in school curriculum, but for outdoors, outdoor classroom, this is a migration challenge. And actually I'll be using it this summer where the kids are migrating birds, and you have different kids represent things like cats and cars, and they have to migrate through, and the kids absolutely love this, and they learn all about the challenges birds face. And last but not least, because of COVID, last year we did virtual summer camp, and there's still resources up through Cornell for cooped up kids, and I pulled a lot of those, and each week we had a different theme, and we sent home those ideas, and it was really great to give kids something they could do to get them outside. So I encourage you, check out all the resources. They're amazing. All right.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I really appreciated how you showed us that you don't have to have the most ideal spot outside to still get kids out and making observations and asking questions. The nature journal seems like a really awesome way to capture that as well. Thank you. All right, so now I would like to to hand it over to our friend Phil to tell us more about his work.
All right. Well, I work at Tualatin Valley Academy, which is in Hillsboro, Oregon, just west of Portland, Oregon. And when I first started teaching at my school, I got permission to put up a bird feeding station along with a covered bird blind for my students. Next slide. And so we're able to go out and take little mini field trips, you know, at whenever the whim hits us. And this is the outside of the bird blind as we're going down into it. Next slide. And so the benefits of having a feeding station at school is you can take lots of inexpensive mini field trips right on campus. You don't have to schedule a bus driver and all that and expense, and you can just go. And it gets the kids outdoors. That was something that was really important to me. I wanted to be able to get the kids out of the classroom. And by doing that, students gain an appreciation for nature through bird watching. I get them using the scientific method as they conduct their own research. They start asking their own questions. Next slide. And all of my students have their own eBird account. And so they get excited by entering their data on eBird because they realize that scientists around the world can use that. And so their data is useful in more ways than one, and not just for their own report. But they use their own data. We use the investigating evidence curriculum, and they are using the data for their own projects as well. Next slide. And so we begin by having the kids learn to identify the birds they see. So we spend a lot of time because they need to get good data. And so knowing what birds they're seeing is important. And then we talk about protocols, how to count the birds, not count the same bird twice. And so they learn how to collect data. Next. There we go. And I put together a tally sheet so that they could collect their data. And it's got the most common birds on there. Sometimes we have to write in new ones. But they're able to keep track of how many of each of those species when we see them. They're on the right side of the paper. But on the left side, we started tracking the weather. And so really easy independent variable that they can compare their bird or all birds with some aspect of the weather. And they'll often look at, you know, total birds and temperature and see how the population goes up and down with temperature or wind speed or something else. And so we use our school's WeatherBug weather station to access that data. Next slide. And so we've been at it a long time. When I first started, I believe, just like Kathy did with Project Feeder Watch. And I sent a picture of the bird blind to Cornell Lab, and they said, oh, you could do classroom feeder watch. And so then that led to, I forget what the intermediate curriculum was, but it eventually became BirdSleuth. And so we've got well over 20 years worth of data. And dark-eyed juncos were the most common species that we were seeing in those early years. You know, up to 60 birds on the ground at the same time is just crazy to try to count. And a few years went by, and all of a sudden, we had a bunch of construction going on. The farm field behind the school turned into houses. The Filbert Orchard across the street from the school turned into an Albertsons shopping center. And all of a sudden, we had house sparrows and hardly any juncos, and the kids noticed. Next slide. And so here's a couple of aerial photos. The one on the left, the black and white, shows our school with the farm field behind. Yellow star is about where our bird feeding station is. And then on the right, you can now see the housing development behind the school, the Albertsons shopping center and more houses across the street from the school. The school expanded. And so there was habitat change. Next slide. And so Christina, one of my 10th grade students, decided to investigate this for her study. And she wanted to know if other schools or other places were reporting less juncos and more house sparrows. And she did kind of a, I forget what her sources were, because this is kind of pre-eBird, but she found the data and discovered that no, this was unique to our area, and concluded that it was habitat loss and all the development around our school. And so she had her article published in one of the predecessors at Cornell Lab to our BirdSleuth investigator now. Next slide. And a few years later, one of my 7th graders did a follow-up study because he was also intrigued by how house sparrows had kind of traded places with juncos. And his article got published as well in the paper that Cornell Lab was publishing. Next slide. And so here's the cover of the BirdSleuth Investigator from 2019, and also shows another article that a couple of my students teamed up with about Steller's jays. But this is so important. I think this is probably one of the most important steps in the scientific method that we as teachers often get left out of. And I want to thank Kelly and the team at Cornell Lab, because there are very few opportunities for students to get their scientific research published. And being able to communicate, we often teach our kids that's a step in the scientific method. But often, you know, what do they get to do? Maybe make a poster for a science fair or something. But here, they get published. And that's really exciting. So again, thank you, Kelly, for making that real. Next slide. And this is just our ongoing research. I put together total numbers of birds against total numbers of species we observed over time at our bird feeding station. And it is just sort of interesting. Total birds, it was fairly steady, and then all of a sudden the total birds went up, I think, when all those house sparrows moved in after the development, but then they declined, and it's been up and down ever since. I kind of get the sense that total birds are declining. I don't know if other people have noticed that, but the numbers of species, I think, have gone up, mainly because I'm getting better at identifying species and seeing them with practice. And I think the takeaway there is you don't have to be an expert to get started. You just need to start. And so jump in. You will learn along with your kids, and it'll get better over time. And I think this is my last slide. I'm not sure. I can't remember. Yep. So anyway, thank you. And so jump in, go for it, you guys. This has been very rewarding, and I'm so glad I did.
Thank you so much, Phil. I always love hearing about all the different ways that your students have examined this long-term data that you have. What a cool resource. All right. So I'd like to invite our next panelist, Terry, to go ahead and tell us more about her experience getting kids outside and observing.
Good evening, everybody. I can't stress enough that Phil is so right. Looking at the panelists here, I'm probably the most novice in utilizing BirdSleuth and getting kids outside and looking at it from a bird's perspective. Do it, just try it. Put one feeder out there and you never realize how many people actually notice it. Right now I teach at the Glastonbury's Hartford Magnet School, which is located in Glastonbury, Connecticut. That's a suburb just southeast of Hartford, Connecticut. And I basically support the pre-K through grade 5 science instruction in our school. I teach 3 sections of pre-K and 3 sections of kindergarten weekly, and then support push-in with all the other grades as needed, in addition to helping the teachers in the area of science instruction. But this year, I started our year off. We are in person, a third of our school anyway, or 2/3 rather, with putting out some bird feeders that I received from Kelly at a conference I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but put them outside my kindergarten classrooms. And the kids just love seeing the birds come to the window every day. When I pass their rooms, they'll say, "Miss Wilson, we need birdseed," or "You're never going to guess which bird came to our window today," or "Do you know what this is?" And so just get the kids started early. They love looking at nature and feeling like scientists themselves and making these observations. This year, we received a garden grant. You could, next slide, please, there. I was like, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm still there." Thanks, Kel. We have a very sterile building and building outdoor space. And as Kathy had said, it really doesn't matter what's there. It's what you can discover about the area and what you can do to improve it. So this year I was fortunate with the Connecticut Audubon Society was to get a garden grant. And with my 4th graders, we're going to be evaluating our outdoor spaces and taking a look at what we can do to make them more attractive for birds and other pollinators. Next slide, please, Kelly. And using the evidence, investigating evidence has been a foundation for the inquiry that our 4th graders have been using. What they've done is we went sort of big picture. We looked at where we are in the Connecticut watershed and understanding how water impacts the land. And the pictures that you see there are, the picture on the left is a front garden that we've started to plant some native pollinators in it, but a lot of it is your standard new school building landscaping with minimum of anything that will attract birds or insects. The middle ground is the rear of our school, which is property that doesn't belong to us. We were actually built on an old cigar factory foundation, and we're in a business zoned area. So it's a little bit of a challenge. And then we also have in the rear of our school, the far slide is a composting bin. So we have a lot of potential. My number one priority, though, is getting our birds back into this area. We haven't seen a lot of them, but with having the feeders, and I think in some respects, Connecticut has really been shut down. So the air pollution and things like that, we've been seeing birds we've never seen before in our school area. Go ahead and Next slide, Kelly, thank you. This just gives you a little bit of an overview. Our location is right in the nexus between those major highways there, and the Connecticut River is to the far left. So the kids were really trying to get a sense of where they are and the environment that our school inhabits. Go ahead, Kelly. Here is an aerial view of our school, and the area that is all green, again, isn't our property, but I am trying to get a better handle on that with the kids so that they can say, all right, well, this is what we need to do in order to observe and let's see, my train of thought just derailed here for a second. In order to plant the best plants that we can. We want to say to ourselves, all right, what's already here? What might be native? What's not native? We're getting a sense of when you have a man-made garden, how is that different from nature's gardening? And a lot of that has to do with birds and other animals planting with their droppings and things of that nature. But at any rate, the kids have done this surveying looking at water sources and hours of sunlight, and they've determined with the green stars that those two spots might be the best place that we put our upcoming garden project. So we're getting there slowly, but then winter hit, so we've kind of put it on pause for the moment. Next slide, please, Kelly. So what we're doing is we really investigated soil and got into some composting. But what our fourth graders have been doing have been talking to our kindergarten kids and finding out what kind of birds they've seen. And we're going to use the data, the little brief interviews that we've had with the other grades to decide what kind of plants and should we plant in this new garden of ours to attract the kinds of birds that we'd like to do it. But as Kathy had said, again, just get started, take baby steps, and the resources on the BirdSleuth on the lab's website are great. Please take a look at them. Give it, take that big step and say, all right, I want to try Feathered Friends or any of those Cooped Up Kids activities. They're just really, really great. And if you ever get a chance to participate in the webinar, or not the webinars, the educators retreat, because that was my first meeting with Kelly, was that opportunity in Ithaca was just amazing and has gotten me hooked. I'm still very much a novice, but you got to start somewhere.
Absolutely. It's really cool to hear how you have different grades working together as well. What a cool opportunity for kids to share their knowledge.
Well, we have to, because that's how they collaborate as scientists,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Terry. It's so awesome to hear all of these amazing different approaches to getting kids outside, creating cool spaces for them to observe, and encouraging them to ask questions. Now I'd love to throw it out to our audience. If you have questions for our panelists, now would be the time to ask. And I don't know if we've missed any in the chat window. And Susan, if we have, if you could flag those for us.
Yes, I think, what are some examples of people using inquiry during virtual programs? If anybody has some virtual tips.
I always start with some kind of phenomenon. So something that isn't easily explained, a brief video clip or a demo of some sort, or even just an image. And you can use some visual thinking strategies to get them to describe it and just, well, what questions do you have? What are you thinking? Getting them to wonder.
That's great, Terry. We've done something similar using video clips before. The bird cams might also be a good resource for you to start sparking some questions. So the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has several live cams that you can watch. And Susan just shared the link in the chat window.
I would piggyback on that and say that, you know, there's, oh no, of course, now I just forgot exactly what I was going to say.
I know that feeling.
Oh, never mind. It'll come back. Maybe.
It'll come back to you and we'll be here when it does.
All right.
There are things you can do. I've had my students making things that they can experiment with, and I've followed the investigating evidence templates to guide them through asking their question, collecting their data, and so forth. And so it can be applied in many, many different ways. And I mean, the sky's the limit. I'm doing some online tutoring with a 6th grader right now, and we're applying this whole stuff to growing bean seeds. And we've got this whole elaborate experiment that she's setting up to do. And so, you know, use your imagination, because it can go a lot of different directions.
Okay, I remember.
Okay.
Early on, you mentioned the different types of inquiry, you know, the confirmation, structured, guided, and open inquiry. It's slide number 15 if you wanted to put it up. But that's a way for kids to, they may not be able to build an experiment or work with others, but they can look at a bird cam, or they can see birds in their thing, and they can look things up. They can do a research of, you know, like explore data that's already out there, and they can do an experiment that way. It doesn't have to be that something they created or worked together with a partner. So there, and I remembered.
Yeah, I would say, you know, even if you're doing virtual learning, they can still do nature journals.
Mm.
If they can't go outside, you know, like even when I was teaching in the classroom, I tell them you can look out the window, you know, and that way, and most likely they can go outside. And the more they look, the more they're going to learn. They're going to start discovering things for themselves.
Awesome. So let's see, we've got a couple questions in the chat window. It looks like Dawn's asking about any opportunities you might see in high school to connect life science and engineering. One of the things, Dawn, just as like a little project we've done before, is challenging students to engineer bird feeders out of recycling. So there might be an opportunity to turn that into a larger testable question about materials or things like that. Sienna's asking if we can give more examples of episodic learning / inquiry activities that would be more conducive to informal education settings for K-12 Edge students. Migration Challenge was one example. Are there more?
Let me think what I use. One really fun thing, we'll use it this summer. They love this. It was about adaptations of different birds. So there's one where the kids are an owl and they sit in a chair. One kid sits in a chair and all the other kids are around them. And you put a basket of plastic Easter eggs, and the owl has to be blindfolded or close their eyes. And the other kids, like the person that's in charge, will point to a kid or 2 or 3, and they have to try to sneak up. And the owl's doing this because you teach them, well, the owl's way that the ears are shaped and one is higher than the other. They, you know, can really hone in on the sound. So the object is a little mice have to try to sneak up without being pointed to, because then you didn't get it. So that was kind of fun, and you could try different ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. I would also suggest we have some resources that might work on our website. The BirdSleuth Explorer's Guidebook might be something that you could check out. It has some kind of one-off activities for observation. things like a sound map and a scavenger hunt. And even those
Mhm.
can turn pretty quickly into opportunities to turn those activities into question generation. So even if you don't get the opportunity to go all the way down the path of investigating your questions, it can still be a really useful exercise to turn observation activities like a sound map into a way to practice formulating questions.
Mhm.
We've used sound mapping at camp, and it's a great way to just get everyone to really just kind of tune into nature. It is one of the kids' favorite things to do.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Mhm.
Yeah, my pre-K kids and my kindergartners love doing that.
Awesome. Well, I just looked at our time and it is a little bit after 9 o'clock. So if anybody needs to check out now, we absolutely understand. I do just want to make sure that everybody knows that you can keep in touch with us. And if you need a letter of completion for your professional development, you can email us at k12lab@cornell.edu and we'll send you a letter for 1 contact hour. And say thank you so much for joining us tonight. Panelists, thank you so much for hanging out with us again tonight and talking about all the ways that you've inspired kids to think like scientists.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
fun.
It was